Today's video was written by Frank Dunas. Imagine 4 minutes. It's very short. 4 minutes, for example, it's very short if that's the time you have left to say goodbye to your loved one before leaving for Vietnam. Or worse, on Twitter. It's short, 4 minutes, if you're mindlessly scrolling on Instagram or TikTok, or if you're listening to your favorite song. But on the other hand, let's not forget the words of our dear Albert. Time is relative. For example, put your hand in the door frame and let me slam the door on your fingers. There, trust me, those same 4 minutes will feel much longer to you. So 4 minutes is both very short and potentially very long. And when you discover the story I'm about to tell you today, I can already bet that you too won't be able to stop thinking about those 240 little seconds, which both caused one of the worst railroad disasters in the United States and at the same time advanced the entire global railway industry. Because on April 18, 1891 in Kipton, Ohio, two trains were speeding toward each other at full speed with neither conductor knowing what tragedy they were heading straight into. Each of the two trains is crossing the country under the spring sun. The scenery is passing by and nothing suggests that in a few moments this is what awaits the passengers on this train. The Kipton railway disaster in 1891 caused 11 deaths. Okay, well, we've seen worse casualties on this channel, but it's also worth mentioning that these were mail trains, which carried more mail than passengers. Still, the postal workers and the drivers on board were still there. And the trauma in the railway industry was very real. This accident left a lasting mark not only on the country's history, but also on the entire global railway system. Because, as you will see, all of this could have been avoided if a simple watch, had not been running 4 minutes late. To understand the mechanisms that led to such a tragedy, we need to go back a little in time. And for that, let me take you back to England on September 15, 1830, where an event took place that would go down in history, the opening of the world's first railway line. At the beginning of the 19th century, the country was a true global hub of commerce thanks to the port of Liverpool. By itself, it handles more than 40% of the world's trade, especially cotton, sugar, and tobacco. England is already leading the way in developing new port infrastructure, and the docks are able to accommodate more than 100 ships at once. A record for that time. But a problem arises in the transportation of raw materials. Indeed, the city of Manchester, located about 50 kilometers east of Liverpool, has expanded rapidly since the beginning of the century, and with the Industrial Revolution has become a major center of the cotton trade. It is therefore necessary, on a regular basis, to transport the huge quantities of cotton from their arrival in Liverpool to the factories in Manchester, which will transform these raw materials into sheets, towels, or winter clothing. Next, these finished products must be brought back to Liverpool so that they can be exported all over the world. Until then, this transportation was done by road or by canal, but both of these modes of transport are slow or dependent on the weather. In short, they're not reliable. So, merchants and businessmen see a need for building a railway line between the two cities. It's a world first and an event reported by the entire press. On September 15, 1830, no less than 8 trains left Liverpool for Manchester to the cheers of the crowd. However, not everyone shares the same enthusiasm, but it's interesting to note that, no matter the era, statements full of bullshit have always tried to hold back scientific progress. Indeed, the arrival of microwave ovens in the 1980s sparked fear among some people who claimed, without any evidence, that those microwaves would trigger completely uncontrollable waves of cancer within the next 10 years. Video games crystallized the fears of opponents who claimed that this activity would lead to an explosion of violence among young people. And so, when we read the testimonies from that time, we see that even at the beginning of the 19th century, those who resisted scientific and technological advances were already present and strongly opposed to these railways that were about to spread all over the country. We find that some people claimed without hesitation that using trains as a means of transportation could pose serious health risks. Yes, but not what you think. So it was said that the succession of images of the passing landscape would destroy the retina, and that moving too quickly from one climate to another would have a deadly effect on the respiratory system, and that any pregnant woman who took the train would systematically have a miscarriage. Which just goes to show misinformation isn't a recent thing. But despite these hesitations, the railroad obviously and quickly became the mode of transportation of the future. Very quickly, the United Kingdom sped up the construction of new railways, the network expanded, and the different companies understood the value of being able to transport goods quickly between the various cities in the country. By following suit, all of Europe would be inspired by the British example. In France, the Lyon-Saint-Étienne line led the way and preceded the major national development of the following 10 years. In Belgium, the first steam line opened in 1835. And that's how, like a spider weaving its web, a gigantic network spread across Europe, forming an impressive national rail network. But this rapid boom is nothing compared to what will happen on the other side of the Atlantic over the next 30 years. Because the United States is a country whose main obstacle to industrial growth is its enormous size. So people will quickly realize the enormous benefits that can be gained from the development of rail traffic. Once Europe demonstrated that rail could quickly transport people and goods over long distances, the expansion of rail traffic in the USA became exponential. Northern states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, or Illinois are investing heavily in this mode of transportation. Cities like Chicago, Cincinnati, or Detroit become essential railway hubs, and between 1840 and 1850 thousands of kilometers of railroad tracks are laid across the country. But this development will not stop at simply connecting a few neighboring cities. One of the most significant events in this field in the United States is the emergence of the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1862, the US Congress authorized the construction of a line connecting Sacramento to Omaha, which was a historic link between the east and west of the United States. Well, when we say the eastern United States, let's calm down a little bit because Omaha in Nebraska is not exactly a coastal city in Virginia. But still, the vastness of this country is such that this railway covers 3,000 kilometers and crosses no fewer than 5 states. So after this first successful attempt, growth did not slow down. It even accelerates. In the following years, the rails connect the ports with the inland areas, the industrial centers with the agricultural zones, and as expected, the transformation of the United States is rapid. From an economic perspective, easier access to raw materials helps the industry develop as it did early on in the United Kingdom. From an agricultural point of view, farmers in the Midwest sell their crops much farther afield than before. And from a demographic point of view, people migrate westward, wanting to take advantage of this economic and industrial boom. Many cities spring up along the lines, and the phenomenon becomes self-sustaining for several years. An entire video could be devoted to this gargantuan expansion and all the incredible adventures that resulted from it, but that will be for another time. Because this providential boom will nevertheless reveal a huge flaw that will inevitably lead to the disaster we're interested in today. Time. Nearly 4,500 kilometers separate the east coast from the west coast of the United States of America. This results in a rather ordinary fact, but one that will nevertheless considerably complicate rail operations. Not all cities have the same time. Noon in Chicago is not noon in Boston. Each city uses its own local time. So, on a long route, a train can pass through several dozen different local times, which can obviously lead to timing conflicts between the lines. Organizing schedules to coordinate all the traffic quickly becomes an impossible puzzle. That's how the different companies realized that to optimize punctuality and safety, it became necessary to define a common time, synchronized across the entire network. So, at this point in the story, after hearing the last sentence, maybe you're thinking, okay, a common time helps improve punctuality, I get that, but why safety? After all, if a train is late, it's not the end of the world. Well, actually, yes, it is. And that's for a simple reason we haven't mentioned since this video's start. At the beginning of the expansion of rail traffic, trains mostly run on the same track. Yes, you understood correctly. Today you're used to seeing train tracks in pairs. But at that time, trains ran on a single track, which they shared even if they were traveling in opposite directions. So you might ask, how do you avoid collisions? Well, it's actually quite simple. They used a passing loop system. The principle is as follows. In stations or at specific and carefully documented locations, side tracks allow a train to temporarily move off the main track, letting the oncoming train pass before continuing on its way. It's clever, but as you can see, this system relies on perfect timekeeping. Which brings us back to the company's goal at the end of the 19th century, to define a universal time. The so-called railway time. On November 18, 1833, what would be called Standard Time was adopted. This system defines time zones, each with a uniform time throughout its area. Well, sure, there are still time zones, and the time isn't standardized across the entire territory. But again, remember that we're talking about a country that's nearly 10 million square kilometers in size. It's absolutely impossible to say that it's noon in Los Angeles and New York at the same time. So the compromise is as follows. Instead of applying hundreds of local times like before, the companies divided the country into 4 main time zones, each one an hour apart. Eastern Standard Time, Central Standard Time, Mountain Standard Time, and finally Pacific Standard Time. And it must be admitted, the adoption of this standardization of schedules brings a lot of flexibility and safety to American rail traffic. From now on, the companies can publish arrival and departure schedules that make sense to the average person. No more departures like Boston 8 a.m. Boston time, connection in New York 10:15 a.m. New York time, arrival in Philadelphia 9:30 a.m. Philadelphia time. With Standard Time, well, we have a departure at 8 a.m. and an arrival at 8 p.m. Thanks to this system, travelers can plan their trips much more easily without needing to mentally convert local times. By relying on their standard, there's no possible ambiguity about the total duration of the trip. From a safety perspective as well, this clarity in the schedules makes it much easier for trains to pass each other on sidings. Since both trains share the same time, there's no need to calculate what time on train A corresponds to the time on train B. At the time, everyone congratulated themselves on this innovation. At the end of the 19th century, the United States railway network was by far the largest in the world. It stretches over no less than 260,000 kilometers and surpasses that of all European countries combined. However, a gigantic flaw in this magnificent organization would lead to the catastrophe of April 18, 1891. Because even though Americans understood that their safety depended on how they kept time, there was still a major thorn in their side that would cost them dearly. The measurement of time. The smartest among you will have already figured it out. While it's infinitely more practical to coordinate for passing tracks with a common shared time, you still need a reliable way to measure that time. At the time, the pocket watch therefore became the critical instrument, the central tool of the system to ensure the safety of travelers. The conductor's watches determine both the moment when the train departs and, by extension, the adherence to arrival times at the passing tracks. However, the watches from the late 19th century were not as precise as our current watches. They are sensitive to shocks, temperature changes, and mechanical wear. And all these uncontrolled factors can lead to discrepancies of a few minutes, which can mean tragedy. And the engineers know that. That's why they maintain them carefully and check their accuracy as thoroughly and as regularly as possible. But there is no strict requirement for an official and certified verification process. All of this is based on trust and individual responsibility. And basically, if you want something to fail, make it depend on individual responsibility. That's how, on April 18th, 1891, train number 21, called the Toledo Express, which was responsible for carrying the country's mail, left that day unknowingly 4 minutes late. As usual, the engineer knows he has to take the siding a few kilometers from Kipton station, west of Cleveland, to let the fast mail train number 14 pass. The fast train consists of 3 mail cars and 2 parlor cars, while the Toledo is a train with 5 passenger cars and 2 baggage cars. Ironically, before this siding, a long curve could have warned the engineer of the Toledo Express. Unfortunately, that day, a line of freight cars on the other side of the station blocked the engineer's view. This prevented him from seeing the mail train coming at full speed just a few kilometers away. And when the two locomotives finally face each other, it's already too late. The Toledo Express should have moved onto the siding 4 minutes earlier. Nothing can prevent what is about to happen. The brakes on both trains are applied fully, screeching through the valley, but the accident is unavoidable. And with incredible violence. On impact, the mail train is thrown into the air, crashing onto the first cars of the Toledo Express, while the locomotive of the latter is thrown perpendicular to the track. The force of the impact sets the first two cars on fire. Yes, because, well, I forgot to mention that at the time the cars were made of wood. The third car crashes down onto the first two, then tips onto the station platform, shattering the building's windows. 6 railway mail service employees die in the crash. The trains are destroyed, the station is devastated, and the damage is considerable. The mailbags scattered around what's left of the cars are still burning when the first responders arrive on the scene. The engineer's watch being 4 minutes slow cost him his life, as well as the lives of several others, with the number varying depending on the source. 9 according to some, 11 according to others. What is certain, however, is that fortunately there were very few casualties among the passengers. On one hand, this was because one of the two trains was a mail train, and on the other hand, because the front of the trains absorbed the entire impact, only the drivers and the postal service employees were fatally affected. When rescue teams arrived, no one could be saved from the flames, and the firefighters faced a truly horrific scene that day. Charles Toplift, the engineer of the express mail train, was found with his hand literally stuck to the brake handle. One of the employees from the same express train who had jumped from the moving carriage to escape the collision was found dead along the tracks. He did not survive his fall while the train was at full speed. Inside the mail cars, the bodies of the 6 postal service agents were found completely charred, trapped in a tangle of metal twisted by the heat and blackened wood. In just a few moments, this simple, quiet stretch of railroad in Ohio has entered history as the scene of the most significant train accident of the late 19th century. This tragic accident will clearly be front-page news nationwide. Overnight, the general public becomes aware of the dangers related to the jobs of railway postal workers. The companies, for their part, realize that there is a major weakness to address and that they will have to react quickly to prevent such a catastrophe from happening again. The Post Office Department makes an official request urgently calling for the construction of steel cars instead of wooden ones. Similarly, an investigation is promptly launched to find the accident's causes. It will conclude that it was due to poor coordination of the trains because of the inaccuracy of the watches on board, and that the crew of the Toledo Express was at fault because of the delay they incurred when they departed. Nevertheless, mitigating circumstances are declared, since these 4 minutes cannot be blamed on negligence but rather on the failure of the watch belonging to the engineer responsible for departure times. That is why the company involved, the Lakeshore and Michigan South Fern Railroad, officially appointed Webb Siebold, a famous jeweler from Cleveland, as the general time inspector for American railroads. His role was to independently investigate issues of time discrepancies and the reliability of watches on trains. 2 years later, the investigation report led to the establishment of a strict set of performance standards and regular inspections for the service watches of railroad workers responsible for keeping schedules. The watches in question are equipped with 19 or 20 lean calibers, which means their mechanisms are intentionally large in order to improve their robustness and stability, as well as to allow for better visibility. Furthermore, from now on, the escapement of these watches must be a lever escapement. So, just as a reminder, the escapement is at the heart of a watch's mechanism. It transforms the energy from the mainspring into regular beats. A lever escapement will provide the user with excellent timekeeping regularity, less sensitivity to sudden movements, and greater long-term stability. In short, from that day on, the watches used by train conductors stopped being simple personal items and became true safety instruments. Regular inspections are now mandatory, and these watches are checked by an authorized inspector who ensures that they meet the accuracy standards established by Webb Siebold. If necessary, they will be simply replaced. For its part, the Pennsylvania Railroad, one of the most famous American railroad companies, requires its employees to use leather cases to protect these watches from dust, absorb shocks, regulate temperature, and limit humidity. with the sole purpose of minimizing as much as possible the sources of time drift in these precious timepieces aboard trains running at full speed. But even so, the story doesn't end there. Of course, people came to understand that understanding time is central to ensuring safety, and not just in railways. This terrible episode must serve as a lesson that the leaders of the time were quick to learn, so much so that several years later, most people believe they have nearly mastered time. Except that's not the case. Soon, everything will have to be rethought from scratch. But humans at the century's end don't know that yet. Because what you have to understand is that measuring time for human beings is a great adventure that didn't start yesterday. Philosophers like Socrates, Thomas Aquinas, or later David Hume laid the groundwork. Then came the physicists with Galileo, who was the first to mathematize time. And above all, Isaac Newton, who laid the foundations of the nature of time in his famous Principia. In short, at the dawn of the 20th century, humans are convinced they have tamed time, especially because they have emerged stronger from various disasters like the Kipton collision. And from those 4 minutes that transformed railway traffic, they learned from this event which challenged their measurements and understanding of the vast concept of time. Some even go so far as to say at the beginning of this century that scientists were basically done with physics, in the sense that different theories like Newton's gravitation, Maxwell's electromagnetism, and thermodynamics seem to form a coherent whole capable of explaining the majority of observable phenomena. From the point of view of time measurement, it is then thought that science only has to refine the details rather than overturn its foundations. Come on, to quantify this, let's say scientists then believe their understanding and control of time was 90% complete. Unfortunately, they would soon have to completely rethink their work and admit that they were actually no more than 10% of the way there. And if you want to know about the tsunami that completely overturned their certainties in less than 6 months, you'll have to watch the rest of this video on Matador's channel, where it's not impossible that you might see me pop in, by the way. So, I'll see you in the rest of this video, right over there. And in the meantime, look up at the sky, be astronomical, and see you in a bit.